Bobbing for Apples, written and read by Ren Bryant. When I grew up, I loved the house next to ours. It was this 2-story craftsman-style house with blue shingle siding and a welcoming front porch. It had a gabled roof, ornate wood framing, and an open floor plan. It really screamed quality, and it put our Rambler to shame. I always said if I could buy the place at some point in my life, I would. And that's just what I did. I signed the papers last week and I'm moving in tomorrow. My parents are long gone from my childhood home and none of my friends live in the area anymore either. Actually, it's bittersweet coming back to this old neighborhood and to this house especially. Buying it was quite emotional, not just because it was some place I wanted to live in ever since I was a child, but because one of my good friends died in the house. It's a memory I'll never forget. It was at a Halloween party in 1987 when it happened. The family, the Jinkers, used to have the best Halloween parties. They would invite everyone from the neighborhood to their house and really do it up. The family would all dress in a matching costume. Even the German Shepherd would take part. I think that year it was Raggedy Ann and Andy family. I remember teasing Nancy, that was my friend who lived there, about the blush her mom put on her cheeks to make the costume come to life. Their party would always be in the basement. It was unfinished, though. Once they put up all the Halloween decorations, you wouldn't know it. There were cobwebs galore, cutouts of Jason and Freddy, and they even had dry ice in the corners to create some smoky atmosphere. There was tons of soda and candy for the kids, and the parents all seemed happy with their adult drinks as well. At least, I remember my parents always being very happy, laughing and smiling nonstop by the night's end. The Jinkers' house was the place to be each Halloween. They also had a tradition, bobbing for apples. Each kid would take a minute, with our hands tied behind our back, dunking our head in a 50-gallon bucket of cold water, slobbering as we did our best to bite the apples and spit them to the side. The rest of the kids screamed and hollered and kept count. James lived at the end of the block and he was the best one. Every year. He was fast as lightning. Those big buck teeth of his really came in handy for snagging the apples. It was a genetic advantage the rest of us didn't have. Bobbing for apples is actually when the accident happened. That's when Nancy died. Nancy was always the last child to bob for apples. It was a benefit of her parents throwing the party, I guess. She got to know exactly how many apples she needed to get. 34 was the record that James set that year. The downside to going last is that you get all the other people slobber in the bucket, and some bits of apple the other kids had bitten off but couldn't get out. Floaters, we called them. Nancy started great, going at it with gusto, making a mess, splashing water as she bobbed and dropped apples next to the bucket like a machine. The crowd chanted 1, 2, 3, 4 with each apple she dropped. Every kid eye was on her, especially James. Nancy had gotten up to 20 apples in half a minute. She was going to beat James's record. But then she started to slow. She took longer pauses in between apples, taking large gulps of air before dunking her head back in the bucket. And then, one of those floaters got lodged in her throat. I'll never forget how her body jerked with her hands tied behind her back. We all thought it was just her being aggressive, really going at it to get the next apple. We cheered her on. We didn't know she was choking and took in more water as she gasped. We didn't know. That was the last party the Jinkers ever held. I guess it made sense since Halloween just isn't the same when your kid is dead. My family moved away a couple years later. I'm not sure what happened to the Jinkers, but all I know is they're not who I bought the house from. That was the Hefners, whoever they are. I didn't really care what their story was. The most important thing was that they were selling the house I always wanted, and they kept it in great shape. Moving in wasn't too much hassle. I hired some hunks with a trunk, and they did all the heavy lifting. I drank lemonade mimosas while telling them where to put the boxes. I only had furnishings for half the room, so the place seemed really empty. In fact, the first night felt so lonely in the big house, all by myself. I didn't have cable hooked up yet, so I was just surfing on my phone and reading. It got boring after a while. And I guess because I had too much to drink, I had really weird dreams that first night. It was Nancy. I had seen Nancy in my dreams. She was still 8, the age she was when she died. Her face looked ashen and sunken, and her eyes were lifeless. Nancy was in her Raggedy Ann costume from that 1987 Halloween party. But she seemed brighter, as if she was glowing. It looked like something bright under a black light. And her face! Her mouth was stuck open, that wide mouth you do when you bob for apples. The dream really freaked me out. I woke up thrashing in my bed and had trouble getting back to sleep. After 30 minutes of fearfully hiding under the covers, I decided to get up and make some coffee. I lit the house up like a Christmas tree, not wanting to be alone in the dark. As I sat and drank my Starbucks dark roast, I thought back to that Halloween party. When I found out the house was on the market, I thought a lot about Nancy. But now I wondered if I hadn't really processed all that had happened. It's traumatic losing a friend, even more so when you're a kid. Maybe I hadn't really dealt with the grief properly, and that's why I had the dream. No, I thought, I did process things. I went to the funeral, I talked to a grief counselor, I did everything. My parents really helped make sure I got over it. And the incident was 30 years ago too. I'm not harboring any grief. It had to be the stress from the move and the mimosas, I thought. That's what gave me the dream. But still, I looked at the basement door. I hadn't gone down there yet. Sure, I checked it out when we did the walkthrough inspection before I bought the place. But I was with somebody else then. I hadn't been down there since I actually owned the house. The basement was still unfinished though. It was still the same as it looked in 1987. The next night, I had the same dream. Well, not totally the same, but I dreamt of Nancy again. Though now it was worse. She was in my bedroom, hovering over me, floating. Her long brown hair draped down against my face, and her green eyes were inches away from mine. I was paralyzed in fear, laying there in bed. I didn't know what to do. Of course, I couldn't get back to sleep again, so I went to brew more Starbucks dark roast. I had never dreamed about Nancy before. Sure, I thought about her when buying the house. I relived those memories. The good times, like us cycling down Woodhaven Lane together and swinging in the community park. And the bad times as well. Even the Halloween party. I thought about it all when getting the house. But I had never dreamed about her. Not like this. Not until I moved here. I looked towards the basement door, the one place in the house I still hadn't visited. It's not that I was scared, but no, actually it was. Like a child being scared of the dark, it was irrational, and I didn't want to admit it, but I really didn't want to go down there. I got chills just thinking about it. It's really silly, I thought. This is my house now. There's nothing to be scared of. There's no one here but me. This stuff that happened, it was 30 years ago. It's water under the bridge. Yet, still, I couldn't control my fear about the basement. For the next few days, I didn't even look towards the basement door. I walked right past it, averted my eyes, and pretended it didn't exist. At night, I took prescription sleeping pills. With those, I had no dreams. But then the pills ran out, and when they did, the dreams of Nancy came back. They got progressively worse, or I got progressively more freaked out. Maybe both. In the latest dream, Nancy led me to the basement, her mouth morbidly open the entire time, bobbing for an apple that wasn't there. She escorted me to the corner of a basement and pointed to the cinder blocks. No words, just moaning, just pointing and stabbing at the air. I was up at 3 a.m., Starbucks dark roast bubbling in my Mr. Coffee. The usual. This wasn't quite what I had in mind when moving to my dream house. I slugged down the cup black, no cream or sugar, and thought about why I loved the house, why I bought it. The woodwork, the layout, the craftsmanship. It wasn't a place to be fearful of. It was a place to live. My house. Yeah, something awful happened in the basement, but that was decades ago. Decades. I looked at the basement door. My fear was stupid. What's next? Being afraid to open the closet because of the boogeyman? These were dreams. That was all. Ghosts don't exist. After a big breath, I decided it was time. It was time to go into the basement, the one place in the house I hadn't visited. I should have done this when I moved in. Why was I avoiding it? There's 4 walls, a ceiling, and a floor, just like in every other room in this house. It was nothing special. It was unfinished, sure, but that's where the difference ended. There wasn't even an evil-looking furnace or anything. It was just a basement. I grabbed the doorknob and took another breath. I told myself it's time for bad dreams and bad memories of a dead friend to rest. Then I turned the knob. The basement stairs were swallowed by pitch black nothingness. It made me gulp. This was going to be more difficult than I thought. The light bulb was at the bottom of the stairs in one of those old school pull string varieties. I hadn't really thought about it before, but I wish the Hefners would have upgraded the electrical and put in a light switch at the top of the stairs. White-knuckling the handrail, I put one foot before the other and slowly made my way into the darkness. The old stairs creaked with each step. When I got halfway down, I stopped. I contemplated turning around and doing this later, sometime when it was brighter. But then I said, no, that's being silly. It's a basement, my basement. There's nothing down here. Finally, I reached the bottom. I was in the basement. It was so dark I couldn't see my hands. I searched around for the cord, and after a minute I found it and tugged. The room brightened to a soft white. The basement was as open as the rest of the house. One big room surrounded by walls of 2x4s and cinder blocks. There was a metal support column that was in the middle of the room, too. Off in the corner was the guts of the house, the furnace and water heater. But those were new, not scary. I smiled, relieved. This is what has been keeping me awake and giving me bad dreams. This was nothing. It was just another room. I laughed and shook my head. What a chicken I had been. I was acting like I was 8, a scared little girl, like when I saw Nancy's head floating face down in that tub of water after she choked and drowned. I walked the perimeter of the basement, tapping occasionally on a 2x4 for good measure. I envisioned what I could do with the place once I had some money. Maybe install a wet bar, put up a big TV on the wall, or maybe add a pool table. Make it a lounge, a place to hang out. I thought maybe I could even throw my own Halloween parties here. My thoughts were interrupted by a blast of cold air that gave me chills. It was as if a window was open in winter, except there were no windows in the basement. I looked around trying to find the illogical source of the cold air, but there was nothing. It was an empty basement. My irrational fears came back and I turned to head upstairs, but when I did, I was greeted by a pale, glowing Nancy in a Raggedy Ann costume, her mouth hanging open, bobbing for apples. It was the same one that was in my dream. I shook my head and pinched myself to make sure I still wasn't dreaming. I was awake, and there was a ghost in my basement staring at me, floating, glowing, a thing I know doesn't exist. I was scared out of my socks and I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My bones locked up tight. My heart went schizo and my breathing followed. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there. Nancy's ghost was haunting. She pointed like she did in the dream, pointed to the corner towards the back cinder block wall. That's where the Jinkers had their smoky dry ice during the Halloween parties. It was also where we bobbed for apples. Then, moaning sounds came from the ghost. It was like Nancy was trying to speak but couldn't because her mouth was hanging open. It sounded morbid and grotesque. As I'm staring at her pale, sunken face, I realized she was moaning the same thing over and over. They were words. She was trying to tell me something. My fear slowly waned. Nancy's ghost wasn't there to attack me. She was there to tell me something. But what? "Nancy," I said, trying to communicate with her. "Nancy." Her ghost just kept pointing, kept moaning, over and over the same garbled, haunting words. "The wall?" I asked, now playing charades. She moaned again. "The corner?" More moaning, more pointing. "That's just some cinder blocks," I said. "It's the corner of the house. There's nothing there." I was trying to reason with the ghost. She pointed and moaned again, the same as before. I shook my head. "I don't know what you're telling me," I said. "I'm so sorry, Nancy. I'm sorry." Nancy's ghost floated towards the corner and pointed to a specific cinder block, moaning the same indecipherable sentence. I gave a quizzical look, still trying to figure things out. All I saw was a block, like all the others. I went closer to inspect, getting close enough that I felt the coldness coming off the ghost. It gave me goosebumps. As I bent over to inspect the block, I noticed the mortar was a different color than the rest. It was darker, newer. The block had either been repaired or replaced. "Was something done to this cinder block?" I asked the ghost. "Was the house repaired or something?" The ghost moaned again, this time something different, but just as indecipherable. I think I was onto something. I think Nancy's ghost had been trying to tell me something all along, something important. That's why she visited me in the dream. There had to be something here. Something in this basement connected to her. I thought about it for a bit and realized maybe that's why the Hefners sold at the price they did. I got the house under market value, which I was really surprised about. Maybe Nancy's ghost visited them and they got too freaked out, like I originally was. Except I knew the ghost was Nancy and they didn't. I ran upstairs to get a screwdriver and hammer out of my toolbox. I was going to chip away at that different colored mortar and see what was going on. When I returned to the basement, Nancy's ghost was still hovering in the same spot, waiting. But I wasn't scared by her presence now. It was scarier when it happened in my dreams, when I thought it was not me having grieved properly. But now that I know it's just Nancy trying to tell me something, well, now I wanted to solve this case. I wanted to help an old friend. I started chiseling away at the mortar as quickly as I could. Chunks flew as I struck my flathead screwdriver with my hammer. I had to avert my eyes to make sure nothing flew into them. Nancy's ghost stayed floating, watching intently. After getting a couple of inches out from around the block, I was able to wiggle it loose. It came out surprisingly easy. Nancy ghost pointed and moaned again, and I shone a flashlight behind the wall. I had to crank my head to peer behind the cinder block, but I couldn't see much of anything. I was going to have to stick my hand back there. I got a bit scared about rats or something else in the darkness biting on me behind the wall, but I realized if I was okay with a ghost, then I'd be okay with some imaginary rodents. I felt around the dirt behind the wall, and then there it was. Something glass, a bottle. Yes, a bottle. Nancy's ghost moaned again, something different this time, and she pointed to her mouth. I didn't understand, but before I could say anything, she dematerialized. She was gone. I didn't even have a chance to say goodbye. just like when she died all those years ago. I inspected the bottle. It was dark brown with a sepia label. The print on the bottle was mostly gone, but I could read distinctly the words, toxic. I could also see a faint skull and crossbones icon. Whatever it was poisonous. Why would a bottle of poison be hidden in my basement? Why would Nancy... I thought back to the Halloween party, the bobbing for apples. Before each kid did their turn, Nancy's parents would refill the water and apples in the tub to make it fair. Then it hit me. Nancy's ghost. She was trying to tell me how she died. She was poisoned, and this was the bottle. She didn't choke on a floater and drowned. Someone poisoned her. Her parents? I covered my mouth and put the bottle down. I didn't want my fingerprints on it any more than they were already. I raced upstairs to call police. I wanted them to see what I found and tell them my theory on what had happened. But I wouldn't say anything about being visited by Nancy's ghost. The cops ran the prints and Nancy's parents were all over the bottle. Though they denied everything at first, Nancy's mom eventually cracked and confessed to the whole job. They said they hated their daughter. They resented her. This was their chance to collect some life insurance money. They both ended up pleading guilty to avoid the spectacle of a trial. I saved enough money to finish the basement. I did it up just like I imagined. Wet bar, pool table, and a big screen TV on the wall. I was never haunted again by Nancy's ghost after I found that bottle. But sometimes when I'm hanging out in the basement, I think I feel a chill or see her glowing presence out of the corner of my eye. But when I look, there's nothing there. I don't know exactly what happened with Nancy, but I like to think she finally found her rest.